So before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to pass things over to Yulia, who is a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, to say a few words.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Yulia. I'm a UC Santa Cruz graduate student and a COLA striker. I'm one of the 41 people who the UC administration refuses to reinstate after firing us for striking for a living wage, and one of dozens of students who are facing student conduct discipline for their activism. The student conduct processes affect both graduate and undergraduate students, and now faculty who are being disciplined through the Faculty Code of Conduct, with particularly egregious charges for militant students of color. Local and state police, who we discovered use military surveillance technology at our picket line, have collaborated with the administration, leaving some students with multi-year suspensions that likely means the end of their graduate careers. I'm grateful to speak here today. I want to thank FUC for their continuous solidarity and thank Donna, who signed and is upholding the UC boycott, for speaking today. So over 250 leading scholars, artists, and activists signed the UC boycott after the UC administration took the punitive route and fired COLA strikers. The UC boycott is one tool in our arsenal that we have to weaponize as we fight for the end of all strike-related student discipline and the reinstatement of the 41 grad workers who were made ineligible for employment and who are effectively being pushed out of their PhD programs. This includes international students and could lead to their deportation, thereby going against the campus declaration that they're committed to protecting international students. In addition to losing their appointments and their income, all fired students will lose their health insurance come fall. In the midst of a global pandemic, it is unconscionable that these students will be stripped of their health care and potentially be forced to relocate. The boycott demonstrates the support and solidarity among academic workers of various ranks. The boycott is a way for non-UC supporters, especially those with academic privilege, to declare that they will not cross the picket line and pressure the university administration to end their punitive measures. The boycott is a natural extension of the strike in that it strategically withholds labor until certain reasonable demands are met. And it's a natural way to spread the strike. To refuse to give guest lectures or provide public speeches, either remotely or in person at the UC, sends a clear message. In times of new forms of academic restructuring, the summary dismissal of graduate workers will not go unnoticed. Similar to the BDS movement, this boycott seeks not to stifle free exchange, but to encourage discussion and debate around some of the most important issues of our time. These include the use of technology for surveillance purposes, widespread precarity, and police brutality on campuses and beyond. This boycott should be honored until all graduate students fired for participating in the Wildcat are reinstated, and the administration vows that there will be no subsequent retaliation, either against individual students or against their respective departments. So you can read more about the boycott and see the current list of signatories. And Tom will probably pop the link. Oh, it's already there. And you can urge the UC administration to reinstate student workers fired for striking and drop all disciplinary measures against them by sending an email. There is a link, there's a tiny URL, UCSC41. It's template email that's already populated that will take you 3 seconds to send. And lastly, if you're able, please donate to the strike fund to support fired student workers. And thank you all.
Thank you so much, Julia. So now I am very pleased to introduce our guest for today. We have Donna Murch with us, who is an associate professor of history at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She is also the author of Living for the City and the forthcoming collection of essays, Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Movement for Black Lives. It is also important to point out that Donna is on the executive council of the AAUP-AFT at Rutgers. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Molly. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. So I wanted to thank Thomas and Molly for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. I also really want to express solidarity with Yulia and all the other graduate workers that have been fired and essentially blacklisted. I can't tell you how much this upsets me, and I want to lend as much support as I can personally and also institutionally from our union, which is the Rutgers AAUP-AFT. I thought I would start this talk just by saying there's a way in which this is coming full circle for me. I was a UC graduate student too in the 1990s and early 2000s, and I was part of that generation of graduate students that organized our union. And it's an important history for you to know about, because essentially what happened is that we had a grade strike, not unlike yours. And we were about 2 or 3 weeks into the strike. And the enormous pressure that was put on us. Faculty violated the fair employment law, essentially, and were threatening graduate students with not writing us letters of recommendation. And it was only with an injunction passed by the state of California that we were able to organize a union. Had it stretched out, we absolutely would have been crushed. And it was just an infuriating time. I was one of 50 students that was admitted into the history department that year, and we were doing 80% of the teaching at the University of California, Berkeley. So it was really, in some ways, it predates the adjunctification of the university. The numbers of adjuncts were much smaller than they are now, but graduate students were functioning like adjuncts. And we were making very little money, and we were paying tuition for the right to actually teach all the classes at the university. So just even hearing about the strike, it kind of re-triggers all that we went through. And in some ways, this talk, it's a mixture of personal and history, because my own personal history is intertwined with the things that I researched. But I think in some ways, it's going to explain partially politically how we've ended up where we are since Berkeley in the 60s. So I first came to Berkeley in the 1990s, and I came to Berkeley really with a vision of Berkeley as the ultimate public university, Berkeley in the 60s. But when I came to Berkeley in the mid-90s, Proposition 187 had just been passed. I had just moved from Europe, and so I arrived back in the United States, moved directly from Berlin to Oakland, and Proposition 187 had been passed. So I was really in shock about what was going on in the United States. Also, the year after I came, Proposition 209 was passed, authored by John Woo, California Civil Rights Initiative. And it was really just the sort of, Berkeley was the antithesis of what I thought it was going to be. It had tiny numbers of Black students. It had, in some ways, the University of California, first with the Bakke decision, then with the Regents decision, and then with the authorship of a Hall law professor of the California Civil Rights Initiative. It was really at the forefront of dismantling many of the gains that I would say stretch back to the civil rights movement. They were dismantling affirmative action, but of course, affirmative action is the product of the fight for fair employment, which was absolutely part of the civil rights movement. So I arrived at Berkeley in the 90s. And the research that I'll be talking about today was actually done in that context. It was me as a Berkeley student in the 90s who decided that I wanted to write a book on Black radicalism using oral history and traditional archives. And in many ways, I was digging through a past that intersected a lot with University of California, Berkeley in ways that I'd never seen written down in a book, but found out essentially through doing historical research and doing interviews. So that's the context in which this starts, and that's kind of the frame for the story that I'm going to tell today. Can everyone see my screen? Good, okay. So this is my book, Living for the City. This is a portrait of a Black Panther protest in 1973, in which they were calling for local Black businesses to support the Black Panther Party. I chose this image because I really wanted a sense of the community-based politics of the Panther Party, not just the vision that was so dominant in the 1990s of this as essentially a small group of armed revolutionaries in berets and leather jackets. And so I chose this image on purpose because I wanted to show the depth of support and also the central role that women and children played in the history of the party. So to start the story off, one of the interesting things that I found researching the party is that initially when I came to Berkeley, I wanted to write an urban history of Oakland. And Robert Self's dissertation had just come out. He'd written a wonderful urban history. In many ways, it did a lot of the things that I wanted to. So I was kind of thrust into this quandary as a graduate student about what to write about. Living in Oakland was really important to what I ultimately decided to write about, which is one of the great surprises that I saw in Oakland is that the Black population of Oakland was overwhelmingly Southern. People identified as Southern accents. You know, I'd spent time in Houston, and if you listen to the way people talk in the Nickel in Houston, it sounds almost identical to an Oakland accent. So what I was seeing was a community that was largely a migrant community that had been transplanted, where people had migrated to the Bay Area. And that for our generation, the Black Panther Party was understood as this northern urban formation that contrasted with a Southern movement of nonviolent civil disobedience. So one of the great surprises of being in Oakland was that, oh, this is a community of recent migrants. So actually a lot of the base for the Black Panther Party, it's founded in Oakland, but it comes from Southern migrants who have arrived in Western cities, specifically in Oakland, and then it spreads to other parts of the country. So as I was writing my dissertation, which later became my book, I talked about it as a story of origins, familiar and unfamiliar. So the Black Panther Party, people felt that they already knew the story of the Panthers. They knew the story of the 10-point program, of the Panthers' march on Sacramento in May 2nd, 1967, to demand the right to bear arms, that they're ubiquitous in popular culture, and therefore we know the story. But what I found out is actually very little is known about the social origins of the party. And one of my biggest surprises was that it actually was formed on a public university campus. So it was the infrastructure in the University of California, the California state and community colleges during the Cold War that the party was formed. So I said in the very beginning that it is a little known fact that the Black Panther Party started with a study group. And that's the history I'm going to talk about in terms of the power of the public university, that the University of California and the community college system of the 1960s actually provided the platform and the infrastructure for the formation of this Black radical movement that starts in Northern California and then spreads throughout the rest of the country. In order to understand this, some historical context is required. And the first thing is just what you see and the rest of California public higher education looks like in the 1960s. Compared to today, it is incredibly well funded. That's central. It was also free, that you could attend all 3 levels of California public higher education, and there were no fees associated with it. This is crucial because you had a generation of young people, many of whom, certainly in the African-American population, were migrants from the South. So Charles Johnson, the historian, does a study as part of Myrdal's Research Institute in World War II, and finds out that the majority of Black migrants from the South who migrate to San Francisco have between 5 and 6 years of education. So in their segregated South, it's not only separate but unequal, but even getting access to high school education was difficult. A third of urban Black communities did not have high schools. So with the mass migration that takes place during and after World War II, this is the single largest Black population movement. And it's really, in thinking about the population of Black population of Northern California, it is produced by this World War II migration. Black population is 2% in 1940, it's 10% by 1950, and then by 1980, it's over 51%. But it's a very recent population that is just located from the South, a lot of it from the rural South. So they enter California at a time when all California education is funded much better than it is today. And it turns out that it is the organizing in community colleges by these migrants from the South that is really the genesis of the Black Panther Party. And I would argue for the Black Power movement in California, that its infrastructure is actually formed on these urban campuses. The Merritt College of the 1960s, before it had been moved up into the hills, which was located near Children's Hospital, where Children's Hospital is today. It was in the flats, just on the edge of the largest Black population settlement in World War II and after. And it's that campus of Merritt that becomes the center, really, of the Black radical movement. And it produces not only the Black Panther Party, but the infrastructure for the US organization of cultural nationalists, and even electoral politicians like Oakland's first elected Black mayor, Ron Dellums, rest in power, who is closely associated with the Black student organizing in community colleges, and really a whole generation of people that take very different political positions in the end of the 1960s are part of this early Black student movement at Laney College, but especially at Merritt College. One of the things that is the background to this is the passage of the California Master Plan. So you have lots of new money that flows into California higher education in the early 60s. And they basically created a tripartite structure where California in the early 60s is just becoming the largest, the most populated state in the United States. And so the demand for higher education is incredibly high. And at this time, in the 60s and 70s, people expected that it was their right to have their children attend college. So higher education is actually seen as a right. And there are no fees associated with it. So this becomes a very important engine for mobility for all Californians. And for Black Californians in particular, you have the children of sharecroppers whose parents may have 5 or 6 years of school, who suddenly are guaranteed an education if you have a high school degree or equivalency, that they can attend forms of higher education. So the master plan is important for the way that it expands California higher education in order to incorporate the baby boom. And it essentially also, how do I put this? It creates tiers between the different layers. So it's in this period that you have the codification of the University of California as the ultimate multiversity that is going to be the recipient of the largest number of federal research dollars. It becomes the place that the only degree granting institution for PhDs. Then underneath that, you have the California state schools, which essentially become professional schools like nursing degrees and teaching degrees. And then below that, you have community colleges, which provide associate degrees. So they're at the lowest rung. But what it does is it creates a structure for local communities to vastly expand community colleges, to hire new people, and to do bond issues combined with state funding. So it does two things simultaneously. It expands access to higher education, but it also stratifies it. And a big part of the Black Power movement in California comes out of actually the community colleges and the state universities in the context of the master plan. Now, how to think about this? First, of course, this matters politically. Right? We had a whole discussion in our last presidential election and the election before about free higher education. This is often treated as something, you know, a kind of halcyon dream that could never happen in the United States. But guess what? It did happen in the United States. It happened at UC California, also in the CUNY system in New York and some of the other public universities. So first, it matters that we actually have a precedent for talking about free higher education today. Not only did it happen, but it's also central to a lot of the kinds of activism that we saw in the 1960s and 1970s. So one way to think about the 60s is this democratization of higher education. This is a global phenomenon. It's not only the United States, it happens in other parts of the world, that roughly you have a doubling of the university student population in this period. And that also explains why it becomes such an important site of political organizing. You have many more people flowing into the university. And then you also have groups that have never had access to the university in large numbers historically, which becomes very important for political mobilization. One of the core points about this is that Berkeley was the core of Cold War contradiction. So you have many of the scientists that had been involved in the Manhattan Project and the kind of nuclear arsenal of the Cold War. It is central to the brain trust of the Cold War, but you also have this vastly expanding public university that is admitting more and more working class students, Black working class students. And in the process of doing this, Berkeley becomes this place of contradiction where it's key to the war effort, it's key to the competition with the Soviet Union, but then it also becomes the cradle of arguably the largest anti-war movement in the United States. So both those things happen simultaneously. It's an unexpected history, but this is how it unfolded. So, and thinking about the prehistory of the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party started with a study group. And this is a picture of the founder of the study group, Donald Warden, who later renames himself Khalid al-Mansour. He founds the Afro-American Association, and he does this after Patrice Lumumba is murdered in Congo. He writes a letter to the Daily Cal, to the student newspaper, and says, all we're talking about is civil rights. What we really need to focus on is what's going on in Africa with the murder of Patrice Lumumba, and also essentially the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. So this is a small study group that comes mainly from just the handful of Black students that were in Bolt Law School in the early 60s. They start meeting in these informal study groups. They start reading E. Franklin Frazier, who wrote Black Bourgeoisie. They're reading Marcus Garvey, who at the time was out of print. And they essentially start having a discussion about what it means to understand oneself as a Black student. It's important to note that in the early 60s, the universally used term is Negro. But one of the things the Afro-American Association does is that they start this process of changing naming, changing forms of self-identification. And they call themselves Afro-American Association because they're looking to decolonization that's going on in Africa and arguing that Black people should be identified as Black, not as Negro. And in fact, to think of themselves as Black in relationship to the Black continent. So this happens also in the context of large numbers of African students that are coming to Berkeley. So Berkeley becomes central in this process of these countries that are undergoing decolonization. They're sending out people to get degrees, especially in economics and engineering, things to get involved in kind of nurturing the new nation. And one of the catalysts for the formation of the Afro-American Association is the contact that Warden and other people are having with African students. So that piece is important. They form this study group, and then they decide they're just such small numbers of Black students at Berkeley. I should also mention that Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism and many other things whose work you might know, he's also an undergraduate member of the Afro-American Association. So they decide that there are not enough Black students and they want to get more involved in the Black communities that surround the university. So they reach out to Merritt College, which is a community college 15 minutes south of the university. And this is essentially where Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who become the two founders of the Black Panther Party, this is their first experience of political organizing, is that they joined the Afro-American Association. And it's, as we know from their autobiographies, they initially are inspired by the attempt to insert Black curriculum into the university and into the community college. So the Afro-American Association is more or less, Warden would consider himself a Black nationalist. When they come to Merritt College, there are large numbers of Black students that join the Afro-American Association. And these students have a different trajectory than the students from UC Berkeley. So most of the students from UC Berkeley are coming from all over the country. Most of them come from either middle-class families or kind of working class families, essentially whose heads were just at the bottom of the glass ceiling in the early 60s. So for example, one of the members of the Afro-American Association by the late 60s becomes a dean at UC Berkeley. So they came from more affluent families that essentially were positioned to take on positions of influence after the civil rights movement. Whereas Merritt College is different. This is located in the middle of migrant, working class Black Oakland with all these recent migrants from the South. And so when they move the study group and begin to recruit in Merritt, they get a different type of person. So less affluent, largely Southern rural migrants from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Huey Newton is from Monroe, Louisiana. Bobby Seale is from Port Arthur. And these are the kinds of students that in some ways are bringing that whole inherited memory from the South and the rural South. And they have a different kind of politics. So you have a branch of the Revolutionary Action Movement that's founded, which is a Black Marxist organization. And then ultimately, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale participate in the study group, but they later break with Donald Warden because they feel that he is really concerned about business. And they are deeply politicized. They are angry about the Bay of Pigs invasion. They're angry about the Vietnam War. So you have a much more precarious working class population that takes some of the radical politics of the Afro-American Association, and then ultimately is going to turn that into what becomes the Black Panther Party. So the 10-point program is drafted, which is the founding of the Black Panther Party, October 15th, 1966. And notably, it includes a set of wants and beliefs. Important among these are the belief in full employment, the right to housing, the argument that Black men should not have to serve in the military. So it's following a politics of Malcolm X. And the first point is really important. It's that we deserve the right to determine the destiny of our Black community. So it starts out with a demand for self-determination, and then it mixes this with a kind of program for socialism, but some of it actually using the language of the Declaration of Independence. So unlike Warden, they are explicitly anti-capitalist and explicitly concerned about how to define Black identity, not only within the confines of the domestic Cold War in the United States, but like Malcolm X, reaching out to the United Nations and thinking about Blackness in international terms. They also talk explicitly about police violence and incarceration. Today, our current movement for Black lives in many ways harkens back and is rooted in the politics of this period, where the Black Panther Party starts by confronting the police and essentially embracing armed resistance to police as a way to enforce a change in values. So I can talk about that more. That is a long story, but you have a combination of a militant anti-capitalism mixed with traditions of armed self-defense that also flow out of some of these traditions in the rural South. I wanted to show you this image from 1968 because when the Panther Party is formed, it's literally formed on the campus, on the edge of the campus of Merritt College. But it has a very strong presence throughout the Bay Area, both at UC Berkeley, at San Francisco State in San Francisco, Merritt College and Laney College. So the public higher education provides the infrastructure for a lot of radical Panther organizing. One of the important issues with the party is that they essentially redefine the terrain of struggle. And they combine an anger about structural racism with interventionist imperial US policy abroad. So one of the most famous discourses that the Panthers are famous for is calling the police pigs. And Huey Newton has a whole discourse about this in his first autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, in which he talked about ways that they were trying to delegitimize the face of law and order. And they chose a pig specifically because they felt that for people that came from rural areas, pigs were associated with uncleanliness and the prohibition against that. They also wanted to make sure to not choose a racialized symbol because they saw themselves working in conjunction with the radical anti-war movement and left on campus. So I think that this image explains it all. You have a policeman, i.e. a pig, carrying a billy club that is napalm. And on it, you see the three different faces of state power: local police, National Guard, Marines. So this reminds us how much the party is about this convergence between youth activism, angry about structural racial violence inside the United States, but explicitly linking it to US imperial projects abroad. So the Panthers are formed on the West Coast and they really do look west. So they are looking west in terms of, looking towards Asia, looking towards Vietnam, looking towards China, even towards North Korea. So Northern California and Berkeley at this point is also very close to the major disembarkation point for the Vietnam War. So this is a story about the radicalization on public higher education campuses in the context of this bloody, cruel imperial war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. An important point about this is that the party is really known for guns, but it only has armed patrols for the first 6 months of its existence. So the party is formed in 1966 and is not disbanded until 1982. But the longest running institution of the party is actually a K-12 school called the Huey P. Newton Intercommunal Institute, and it runs from 1973 to 1982. So in keeping with its origins in a study group and its deep commitment to political education, its longest running institution is actually a school. And that is a reminder about the importance of educational access to the party throughout its history, not only as kind of a cradle that nurtured the party in its origins, but that through their newspaper, through their schools, through the educational component and their free breakfast programs, that political education is the through line for the party. An important point about this, before I get to the story of Backlash, is that, so really, throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the first half of the 1970s, these public campuses are such major sites of struggle. The Panther Party runs an electoral campaign for mayor and city council in 1973. Almost all of its infrastructure for this literally its campaign workers come from, again, campuses, UC Berkeley, Merritt College, and Laney College. And here I have a fundraiser that's from, I think it's from Laney's Black Student Union. A lot of the ways that they actually raised money were having dances and events on campus. So I think as we look back to this period in which public higher education is free in California, it is a period of amazing politicization where the university absolutely becomes a central platform for left organizing. And I think that that's important to understand also for what happens later. So this begins the very ugly story of repression. So the Black Panther Party is targeted by the counterintelligence program, but also all different levels of police, of municipal police, state, county, even the CIA has a division that dealt with the Panther Party because they were claiming that they were international insurgents inside the United States. This, on the left-hand side, is a cartoon that was attributed to the Panther Party, but was actually drawn up by one of the local agents in the San Diego office. I use this because I want to remind people about the way that it used sexual politics. The Panthers believed in coalition politics. They were allied with the radical wing of the anti-war movement. And part of the goal of state repression was to recast the Panthers' fight for this radical vision of politics as a kind of interracial sex. So this use of sex and this idea of deviance, that what really drove the Panther Party, first of all, was only men, and it was about Black men's desire to be with white women. So this was a core way in which the party was delegitimized and was used actively to mobilize people against the party. So I could talk for hours about the repression the Panther Party faced. I'll just say for now that the majority of counterintelligence in the 1960s was directed at the party. It was the single biggest focus of state repression. What's remarkable about this is that the party is small. I mean, up until 1968, it's about 75 people. In 68, during this period of the Free Huey Newton campaign, so Huey Newton is arrested a year after he founds the party. He's thrown in prison. He's charged with capital murder. He undergoes 3 different trials. Even though it's a local case, he's actually housed in San Quentin. Enormous amounts of repression. A year after the party's founded, its 3 major leaders are all incarcerated. So enormous amounts of repression. But this repression also took other forms. And one of them is that in the 1970s, you have people like Samuel Huntington, who was very important in some ways, the conceptualization of my first book, because it's Huntington in his book, Political Order and Changing Societies, who actually advocates the repression of literacy abroad. Because his argument is wherever you see the spread of literacy, you see the spread of the left. And so he writes about the dangers of expansion of education at all levels, literacy all the way through higher education. And he actually has an interpretation that he writes. He's one of the authors of the Trilateral Commission report. And part of his argument is that this sudden access of groups that have been previously excluded in the university is an important site of radicalization. And he saw that as dangerous. And so there is a whole kind of reckoning of forces of power in the 1970s who essentially see what happened in these public higher education campuses as dangerous and as disturbing. And as part of the backlash, we don't only have direct state repression, but we also have a kind of rethinking of, I hate to use the word thought leaders, I hate that term, but that's what they would be called today, these kinds of more like defense intellectuals in dialogue with heads of corporations and other powerful people in the United States. And in the Trilateral Commission report, they have a discussion about this, like what's happened to our universities? How has open admissions been instituted at CUNY? How is it that the Black Panther Party is, drawing thousands of Berkeley students? And its infrastructure comes from public higher education. So the 1970s are a period of kind of the different kinds of forms of power in the United States really reckoning with the scale of upheaval that happened on public higher education campuses. A quick note I wanted to make about this is that I was living in New York in the 1980s and 1990s, and I had a lot of friends who were part of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies who were CUNY students. And they were fighting Ed Koch at the time, who was driving up fees for the CUNY system, Ed Koch and the governor of New York. And their interpretation was always that fees are political, that this is not a question of simply fiscal management, that it's a recognition that there has been this transformation over the past 20 years, this is in the 1980s, of who the student body of CUNY was. Same thing I would argue happened in the University of California. So instituting fees in some ways, it wasn't just about saving money, it was also about changing the composition of the student body. And that's how these student activists in New York in the 1980s saw it. And so when I moved to Berkeley, I still had in my mind that argument that I saw actually first made in New York. And it helped me to understand what I was saying about the evolution of the University of California. So this brings us full circle to what I was talking about, which is Berkeley in the 90s. So I'm at Berkeley 30 years after the Panthers have been there. I entered the history department in 96. And in many ways, the university that I saw was unrecognizable because in so many different ways, it had shored itself up against the movements. And when I wanted to write a dissertation on the Black Panther Party, I had someone on who would have been on my committee refuse to do it. And I can tell you more about that. But that to me is just a kind of indicator and metaphor of the depth of ways that the University of California system, and especially Berkeley, shored itself up against the 1960s. And lo and behold, we have something that I call Berkeley in the 90s, embodied by John Woo, author of the Torture Memo, and of course of the California Civil Rights Initiative. So interestingly enough, just like we saw in the Black Radical movement, the international and the local are also connected. So I'm going to conclude my talk, which has gone a little bit over, just by talking about where I am now. I'm on the executive council of our union, which includes both, we have two different bargaining units. The bargaining unit that I'm in includes tenure track and tenured faculty, non-tenure track, so lecturers, and then also graduate students. And I think one reason I'm active in the union is because I was involved in those union organizing efforts in the 90s, but also because I have a deep, deep commitment to public education. I really care about it. And I care about it both because of my own personal history, but also because of understanding its central role in radical movements over the last 50 years. So there's a lot going on at Rutgers. I would say we have a radical union. We won a contract last year, which is unlike any other contract, in which we fought for the equalization of pay. We were trying to figure out how to fight structural inequity in the university. So we fought for the equalization of pay between the three campuses. So I teach at New Brunswick, which is the so-called flagship campus, and then Newark and Camden. On average, Camden faculty made $20,000 less than New Brunswick faculty. So we fought for the right of people to fight for pay equalization as a way to fight structural disparity. We also fought and won to have people appeal on the basis of race and gender inequality, to have pay increases. So there's an equalization of pay across race and gender categories. There are a number of other things our contracts have included, but I think thinking about it as another piece, in many ways in the time of COVID, the crisis of what's happening with the public sector because Trump is not bailing out the states, that the huge crisis right now in public sector employment. At Rutgers, we have 30,000 workers. Rutgers is one of the biggest employers in the state of New Jersey. And our union has created a 19-member coalition. So we're using a coalition not only of academic workers, but with all of the workers. And we're actively involved in trying to organize. We have 20,000 unionized workers and 10,000 who are non-union. And we're actually working with AFT to unionize the remaining 1/3. But it's an example of how faculty can use tenure, and in the case of, every different category. In my case, I'm a tenured professor, but it's a way to also think about how to use tenure, not just for academic freedom, narrowly defined, but also for activism, like the Jewish socialists in the 1940s and 1950s who fought for tenure in the CUNY system. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Thank you so much, Donna, for that fantastic talk. We do already have a few questions, well, a few people lined up for questions in the chat. I'm gonna kind of go through you in kind of order and kind of unmute you so you can ask your questions of Donna yourself. And please do send me a kind of a private message via the chat if you want to take a question, or if you want to ask Donna a question, and we'll kind of go through it. So first we've got Gabby Kirk, and I'll just kind of quickly unmute you now, Gabby. So Gabby, yeah, thank you. Please ask your question.
Thanks so much, Dr. Murch. I'm a PhD candidate in geography up at Davis. And this was and I live in Oakland. This was so wonderful because I've been, the African and African American studies at Davis just had 50th anniversary things, and like the early BSU demands to stop police harassment of Black people in Davis overall, not just on campus. Really cool to kind of think about the on and off campus of the public university, like that's blurred, and that's really relevant today. So I guess I had two questions. One is if you have anything from your archives or other resources for thinking about Black Power and Black Panther Party historically at places like Davis and other UC campuses. And then the second question is kind of to talk a little bit more about policing on and off campus, the way that it was being kind of talked about in the time period that you're talking about. But obviously it's on all of our minds today with Disarm and Abolish UCPD. And my understanding is UCPD really gets a lot of its power in the 60s as a deputized force in order to deal with things like Black student organizing on campus. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about policing and police militarism as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. Should I respond after each individual question?
Yeah, I think that's what we've normally been doing. Yeah.
I know very little about Davis. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. Even Los Angeles, we don't have a comprehensive history at all. And Los Angeles, in some ways, is even, how do I put this? This level of repression in the big cities. Los Angeles, of course, with the killings of Apprentice Bunchy Carter and John Huggins by two members of the US organization, and the killing of Fred Hampton in Chicago, and then the Panther 21 in New York. So as bad as repression is in the East Bay, it's much, much worse in the bigger cities. And LA's story has not been told. So if we have any history graduate students on the line, this is a history that desperately needs researching. In terms of police on campus, I mean, there's not very much discussion of that because a lot of this use of private security forces and police comes later. So most of the period I was talking about was the early 60s, as you said. If I had to guess, I think a lot of that expansion is probably in the early 70s, and the period that I had when I was talking about the kind of national discussion and the Trilateral Commission report. But that is also, there's so much still to be researched. This needs to be researched. So I didn't have time to talk about this, but my argument is that it's the campus and the street, that a lot of the incubation, the campus is almost like a site of incubation where these study groups are formed, people start meeting each other. And this is why the public campus matters so much. In a campus like Merritt, which is a completely urban campus, people are just passing inside, now they're passing on and off campus. And there are a lot of people spending time on campus that aren't students. And it also encourages people to go to college because their friends are there and events are happening, and the lunchroom is the major site of politicization and argument and political discussion. So in that sense, it is a truly fluid space. And that is quite different, I think, with most public campuses. I mean, at Berkeley, we always talk about how the building of University of San Diego was a response to what Berkeley was, that they never wanted a central organizing site like Sproul Plaza. So I would say that the biggest issue on campus was about police, not all of whom were Berkeley police. You had all different kinds of police that would converge and beat up demonstrators. And that's where you're seeing the use of the police as pigs. A lot of that takes place of, anti-war protesters on and off campus being beaten by police and jailed. And so that is a big piece of it. I don't know if they're making the distinction between campus police as we would today, between campus police and the wider police force.
Thanks, Donna. So we now have Matt R, who's asked to ask a question in the chat. So I'm just going to unmute you now, Matt.
Thanks so much, Donna, for this talk, and thanks to the organizers also and the strikers. And thanks for mentioning John Yoo, who's kind of like a living statue, worth considering. But my question, I guess, is about political education, and if you can speak to kind of what how the Panthers built ultimately like an institution of political education, or the kind of Oakland community school, and maybe what institutions or forms of political education were taking place between the reading group at Merritt College that kind of ushered in the movement, or ushered in the organization, and the school in '73, and if it was connected to the kind of wider political education movement outside of the university, like all these schools that existed in the Bay Area, even, that offered kind of free classes, to like Nairobi College and East Palo Alto, which was a kind of a community, an accredited community college, but that was run independently. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, arguably, every part of Panther organizing entailed political education. So even with the party's founding on October 15th, that they used a 10-point program. I mean, that in itself is a form of political education. They're selling Mao's Little Red Book also as a way to raise money. But if you even look at that, what we want, what we believe, that structure as a demand structure has been used by so many different organizations. Most recently, the one I'm familiar with is the Movement for Black Lives and their a vision for Black lives in 2017. It's based on that same structure. So from the very origin that they used a founding document with wants and demands is crucial. And the way that they define those demands entailed political education, like using Malcolm X's idea of having a plebiscite, going to the United Nations. So I would argue that even that 10-point program starts the process of political education. But the way the police patrols worked, which were the founding institution of the party, is that they would go around and watch when Black people are stopped by the police. They would carry with them a law book of California statutes. And then as the police are arresting or brutalizing people, they would read to them what their rights are under a state of California law. So even that had this element where it combined armed self-defense, but also education about what people's rights are. I'd say the single biggest institution of political education the party had was its newspaper. So its newspaper starts in April 1967. And this is one of the reasons that the party is so influential. It was the incredible value in its newspaper. So if you can imagine, this student, some of them are students, some of them are not, some people are dropouts, but that they were able to run a major newspaper from April 1967 through 1980 is incredible. And the newspaper is regularly being published after the beginning of 1969. It's irregularly published up through 68, but it had this incredible content. It has international reporting, it has domestic reporting, it talks about what the Panther Party does. Emory Douglas, the Panther artist, who is now incredibly celebrated and has had shows at all the major museums in the United States, he was producing original art for every single newspaper, and that they had color printing. So it's one of the reasons we know so much about the party, because they created their own organ for providing not only the developments within their party, but also their interpretations of what was happening in the United States and the world at the time. So I think the Black Panther newspaper, which is the primary way that the party supported itself financially, which is important, but it was an amazing source of political education. We are still going back to that newspaper, even to mine it for political interpretations. I mean, they formed the National Committee to Combat Fascism, but there's a whole argument inside the Panther paper about what law and order and fascism looks like in the late 60s. And then finally, the use of political education in their breakfast programs. The school develops out of the breakfast programs because, well, I should say they developed together, because the argument is that they wanted to invite children in to learn, but they saw that they were hungry. So the breakfast programs themselves also have an educational component, and then those evolve into schools. Even their electoral campaign, if you go back and you look at what the leaders said about running for office, you know, they said they wanted to win, but what they really wanted to do was to put a tax on the Port of Oakland, not unlike the financial tax that was talked about in 2016, so that the city of Oakland could benefit from all the different transactions running through what was the 6th largest port in the United States at the time. So they were using that as a way essentially to talk about how you had such poverty in the city of Oakland amidst all of this wealth of transportation and commerce going on. So even as they turned towards electoral politics, it always had a political education component to it. And they created a new 10-point program, which I think became a 22 or 24-point program that had all these different issues about the political economy of Oakland in its demands.
Wonderful, thank you, Donna. We do have a question from, well, it's not really a question, but we're kind of a request from Simon. He's asked if you would mind kind of putting up the Emory Douglas slide that you skipped over, and if you could talk about it a little bit.
Okay. By the way, I have to point out to you that there is another, I thought he was going to say the Emory Douglas portrait. If you can see over my left shoulder, that is also an Emory Douglas portrait of Paul Robeson. See, I'm no longer sharing my screen, right? Can you guys see the screen?
I think you have to do it. I think you have to do it again.
Okay. So which image did he want? It's all the same, or this image? Paul, what do you think?
Yeah, that one. Yeah,
so this image is one of the most important images, I think, when the party come up with the idea of representing the police as pigs. I just have to say, I'm a vegan, and so I always have this like moment of discomfort when I'm talking about this, but I also want to have historical fidelity to how the Panthers understood this. So let's see if I can read it. A low-natured beast that has no regard for law, justice, or the rights of people, a creature that bites the hand that feeds it, well, you get the sense. Where do I begin? First, I'll say something about Emory Douglas. This is another example of political education of the party. One of Emory Douglas's ideas as an artist, he too was the product of public higher education. He went to San Francisco City College, where he studied commercial design. And one of his arguments about political art is that political art should always be influenced by popular representations and even commercial art. So he thought that it was important to choose an art that would speak to ordinary people. So not using high art as the kind of inspiration, but speaking specifically to forms, choosing vernacular forms that would be recognizable and meaningful to people. So in some ways, the idea of the pig as a way to delegitimize law enforcement was a collaboration between Huey Newton and Emory Douglas. Huey Newton comes up with the idea, and then Emory Douglas really represents it throughout the Panther paper and gives it the thrust of this, powerful representation. Huey Newton talked about the choice of the pig, and he quotes Nietzsche in Genealogy of Morals. And essentially the argument is that he who controls language and meaning controls power. So there was a lot of thought put into this. They purposely chose an image and an animal that they didn't think could be racialized, because they saw themselves essentially as suffering the same fate as the multiracial anti-war protesters were in Berkeley. They were all getting beat up by the police. The Panther Party and Black people in general are policed and targeted in ways that white people are not. I mean, all you have to do is look at the difference between how the Revolutionary Underground was treated versus how the Panther Party was treated, and the total numbers of political prisoners and the lifelong criminalization, even people being forced into exile, like Assata and Peter O'Neill. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Emory Douglas.
Okay, great. We do have Joyce King on Stack, so I'm just going to kind of unmute you, Joyce.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Thank you. This was really a wonderful presentation. Had a comment and then a question. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I was at Stanford when a lot of the things you were talking about took place. But I wanted to just comment that my family migrated from Oklahoma in the 1930s, and they were in the Bay Area much longer, I think, than the people that you were talking about in Oakland. So the story goes back a little farther, back to the 1930s. My question, can you hear me?
I can, loud and clear.
Oh, okay, good, good. My question is, do you have any observations about the education or preparation of graduate students to do this kind of research? And did you get any pushback when you wanted to do this kind of study?
Thank you so much, Joyce, for all of those questions. I'm so glad that you brought up the migration that predates World War II, because that is also an important part of the story, and I didn't have time to talk about it. But you know, there's a dynamic always, and it's true for international migration as well, the phenomena of how when people migrate at different periods, in some ways, they often end up with different statuses. So part of the way the racial regime worked in the Bay Area is that the newcomers were faced with the greatest brunt, I think, of racism, that as their numbers grow in large numbers, you begin to actually see an acceleration. One of the things that surprised me in researching California is that California state law didn't have Jim Crow statutes on the books for education. The segregation statutes were for Mexicans of Indian descent. So in some ways, you know, that 2% of population in 1940, in some ways they were the old settlers. Their numbers were very small. And to some extent there was a tension. This is what I saw in researching the Black Panther Party. There was some tension between the older settlers and then the newcomers, because even 8 years could make an enormous difference. Because with the smaller population that predated it, one, there's an economic difference. I mean, the people that migrate during World War II are trying to take advantage of this defense mobilization and get jobs. So in general, the older settlers were more affluent than the more recent migrants. And the thing about the party is that in addition to fighting imperialism and this very confrontational relationship with the state, they also had a bootlickers gallery in which they essentially attacked what they saw as the national Black middle class leadership. So I had a slide that I took out of my presentation because I didn't have time, but it's a slide of a caricature of Roy Wilkins licking the boot of Lyndon Johnson. So there was a lot of anger. There was also anger at Thurgood Marshall. And one of the ways that I interpret this has to do, and this is where Oakland is quite different than Los Angeles, that the numbers of Black people that predated these new migrants were so small that the Panthers in some ways, and even that migrant generation, they are so overwhelmingly and demographically larger than the communities that they entered. And I actually think that's one of the things that produced that kind of militancy, that you didn't have an older generation or a real established Black elite the way that you did in older cities like New York City or Chicago. That was one of my big surprises, which is why Oakland, you know, in my mind, also I'm from the East Coast, right? A lot of us from the East Coast are East Coast centric, but I always thought, why would the Panthers form in a place like Northern California, in which the Black population is so recent? And as I researched it more and more, I saw that part of the reason you had this kind of mobilization was the militance of these Southern migrants coming out of the South. And then in terms of being a graduate student, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because this goes back to how I started my presentation. Enormous amounts of racism in the UC system. When I was at Berkeley, in the history department, there were between 250 and 300 graduate students. Of those nearly 300 people, there were only 3 Black students. And this predates, I entered just as the Board of Regents decision is made, just as the California Civil Rights Initiative is passed. And the difficulty of being a Black student at Berkeley was very, very difficult. I imagine now it's even more difficult. Our numbers were so tiny, and the consensus of not having any form of affirmative action, which often meant just not admitting Black students at all. It was a very, very hostile, difficult place to be. And all the Black students I know had a very hard time. So we got educations that allowed us to give jobs, but I know very few Black students who went to Berkeley when I was there who would say nice things about it. It's a deeply racist institution. And that's part of the reason I can tell this story, because it's also what I witnessed when I was there. And I remain very upset about this. These are public institutions, but they're really not public institutions for Black people. They're not. I was a transfer student from the rhetoric department. So out of those 3 Black students in the history department, 2 of us were transfer students. I came from the rhetoric department, and one of my colleagues came from folklore. So it was a sense that we're in this like top public institution, but look at the demographics of the state of California and who can be admitted into it. So for me, that remains a real source of anger and sadness about Berkeley. It also has a terrible record of hiring Black faculty. When I was there were only 9 tenured Black professors. So just think about that, just like let that sink in. At UC Berkeley, 9 tenured Black professors. There was 1 Black history professor in the entire history department, which had about 60 people. So it was absolutely not a welcoming or a kind place. I could go on, but I won't.
Okay, we have a question from Aziz. I'm just going to unmute you.
Hi, Donna. Thanks very much for the presentation. That was great. And greetings from Montreal. But I just wanted to ask, given the scale of student debt in the States, how you see this as a factor in constraining and disciplining scope for student movements and radical intellectual and political work that bridges both campus and broader community struggles today, by comparison with the 60s and the 70s context, which you described. And I guess whether you've got any reflections on the kinds of strategies that there might be today, learning from history, but also being cognizant of the current context to kind of push back and, you know, to build struggles and movements. So thanks.
Thank you for that question. I mean, I had a really amazing discussion with Astrid Taylor for a piece that she's working on. And I had this like moment of insight from something she said. I was telling her the story that I told you about the community colleges and free higher education and the profundity of the political effects on the United States. And she said to me, it's interesting to think about that and the passage of for-profit colleges that happened somewhere in the 80s or 90s. So one of the big differences is that working class students, people from poor and working class backgrounds, could go to free higher education because it was free, right? And also you had a lot of veterans, and that's part of the ex-Black military are very important to the Panther Party. So Geronimo Pratt, the Geronimo Gijaga, who becomes political prisoner, that enormous political fight that goes on, he's former military. And a lot of the Panther leaders came out of the military. And we were talking about the institution of for-profit colleges in the last 50 years. Half of the money for the veteran benefits are spent on for-profit colleges. Just like take a deep breath and think about what that means. So the GI Bill, you know, for contemporary military, half is being spent on for-profit colleges. So there's been a multitude of things that have happened. It's not just the rising fees inside the public universities, it's also the opening up and deregulation of this, essentially for a commodity that has no value added. When you attend a for-profit college, it does nothing to increase your income. So, you know, there have been so many battles that have been waged against poor and working class people getting access to education. I mean, of course, it starts with K through 12 and the defunding of public education, charterization, which is partially a response to the desegregation of education under Brown versus the Board of Education, where you had massive resistance where white people start creating academies for themselves and figuring out how to get state money to fund them. That's the prehistory to the charterization movement. So I think that through for-profit education, the defunding of higher education, and just more generally, you know, the idea that we've come to celebrate in higher education in the United States education is measured as a commodity in which, you know, the harder it is to get it and the more rare it is, the better it is. So schools brag about, you know, only accepting 3%. But you measure the value of an education based on how inaccessible it is to everyone else. And I think this is a completely toxic idea. So I don't know if that speaks to it, but we have many things going on in the US. We have intense downward mobility and deunionization and a shrinking of the redistributive state. And all of this has affected higher education. So how would I put this? I'm careful to not hold up the 1960s and 70s and make it stand outside history and say we should look back to that. We do have to know that that happened so we can use it to fight. You know, it's the idea of you use the past to fight for the present, for a world that we want. But we need to do away with, first of all, we need to completely eliminate all for-profit colleges. That to me, like the work that the Debt Collective and others have done, and also, you know, our president, in addition to being a real estate agent, what did he do? Defraud poor students who paid for what they thought was an education. And we need to fight for free higher education to make this a possibility again. But there's much less opportunity for upward mobility in the United States right now. I mean, I'm not telling you things, you guys understand this even more than I understand it, but I am amazed at how inaccessible the most important things are. Healthcare, obviously, but also education.
Thank you, Donna. We do have a question from former speaker Joshua Clover. So I'll just kind of unmute you quickly, Joshua.
Hi, Donna. I want to echo everyone in expressing how much I appreciated that talk. And now I'm going to do something which is potentially unfair, which is to sort of ask you to ventriloquize the party in 1966. I'm really interested in the question of demands, in part because trying to work in solidarity with the COLA movement and various other things that are happening currently, there's been a lot of question about demands and figuring them out and so on. And I'm really interested in the first two demands in the 10-point program. It's always seemed to me that the demand for full employment and the demand for self-determination are fundamentally incompatible, since wage labor means trading your self-determination for the wage. And so I get why it's a progressive demand. I think about the Poor People's Movement and various other full employment movements over the course of the last century, that in general want to sort of integrate with capital in a more advantageous position. But I really have trouble understanding how a militant and or anti-capitalist organization would make full employment a demand rather than no employment, right? Especially given analyses like James Boggs and so on, that the job market is headed that way anyway. That's from 1964. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to the Black Panthers in particular, as opposed to, you know, unions or something like that. The Black Panthers in particular, reconciliation of their militant program with the desire for that kind of integration into capitalism that full employment always implies.
I mean, it's a hard question because the truth is I'm a historian, and what that means is that I am most interested in documenting why people did what they did versus assessing it through a more contemporary lens or even comparing it to other trajectories they might have taken. I think that if you look at the 10-point program, in many ways, it's written by people in their late teens and early 20s who are coming of age and are piecing together different types of politics. And the party in general was a bricolage of all different kinds of politics. So the surprise that they use the format from the Declaration of Independence, and then they combine that with these quotes that are almost lifted from Malcolm X. And then they also combine it with what they see as a program of socialism, where they care about housing and employment. They're calling for a redistributive state. So I think in their mind, they are looking at a world in which their parents migrate to the Bay Area to get jobs in defense employment. And this is one of the beautiful ironies of the Panther Party. These are literally the children of defense migrants who migrate during World War II. The problem in the Bay Area is that they're working in an industry that doesn't have a peacetime application. So their parents migrate and work in these shipyard jobs. They fight and organize. They force the federal government to open up and to give Black people jobs in federal shipyards. But then in 1946, all these shipyards shut down. And so they're coming of age in a world where their parents have this brief period of migration in order to get high-paying jobs, and then they lose those jobs. And they deal with a real contingency and precarity and an uncertainty of an employment. And so part of the origin of the Panther Party is that this is not, it's partially a Black working class movement, but it's also a movement that knows what it's like to live without jobs. In that way, it's very different than the story of Detroit in 1964. It's more what happens to Detroit maybe 10 years later. So I think that what they want is, they want livable wages. And I don't, in terms of measuring what radicalism is, you know, this is a Black working class organization that comes from the children of Southern migrants, and it matters that that's how they understand it. And so I don't measure it against an ultimate vision that elimination of employment is a more radical vision than the fight for a true redistributive state. I don't actually see it in those terms.
Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Donna. We have one more one question from the stack. I think the person has left, but I think it's still a kind of a significant thing to ask. And please, I mean, I don't know how much kind of time you've got left or anything, Donna, but we do have kind of what we have one more kind of question to go, and then maybe if something else comes up, it probably won't do at this point. But so this is from where is it? Sorry, this is from Petter's Fire, who I think has left. But they've said teachers and their unions in recent times have been quite adept at killing their own momentum, returning to the fold of respectability. Days of reckoning are approaching in terms of forced restarts. What is your assessment of teachers' relative power moving forward into the immediate?
Wow, that's kind of quite a question. I don't see it like that at all. You know, at Rutgers, we draw incredible inspiration from what's happened with the CTU and UTLA. And in a country like the United States, which is so deeply anti-communist and anti-union, you know, my big frustration is the attempt to imagine that the United States, if we just try harder, will be social democrats. We have no traditional social democracy in this country. We are not Europe, we are not Scandinavia. So it's very important when we do have victories to celebrate them and not to be an ultra leftist. I find that actually to be a problem. I am inspired by the successes that UTLA and Chicago's Teachers Union and all the wave of teacher strikes that have happened. So I don't even fully understand the last part of the question. The cost, it depends on who you are in the university, but certainly being a full-time faculty member and working with the union, it's not particularly helpful to your career. And one of the things that helps people is to look towards these victories of, you know, when such a tiny percentage of the United States population is unionized. We need to celebrate our victories and build on them, not just critique. I could easily tell you a critique of many different things, but I actually think thinking about the usable past and the usable present is really, really important. We are engaged in enormous fights right now with so little on our side. And so I actually don't even fully understand. I would not narrate the teacher strikes of the last 10 years as a failure. I'm a little bit confused about that. Maybe someone else can explain it to me.
Would anyone like to, I mean, we've obviously had problems with our own union, UAW 2865, and there are people here that can probably better narrate that than
so
me.
Talking about the graduate student union, is that what they mean, or they meant?
I don't know, but that's my kind of personal experience. I'm just kind of seeing if.
For graduate student unions, that makes a lot more sense to me, to be honest. I took that K through 12, so please no one feel silenced and talk critically about graduate student.
Yeah, I mean,
I have no problem with that.
If somebody has kind of something to say about about kind of any of those unions, be them kind of teachers or kind of academic work or kind of general kind of academic workers, please make yourself know.
You can do it anonymously if you want, with your picture not up. I don't remember names.
I think one part of this question, I don't necessarily need to recuperate this question from someone who dropped it then left, but I think there's an important question about what happens when there is we are compelled to return to campus for some school districts in the fall, and what possibilities that might open or actions that might entail in response to that.
Yeah, I absolutely support that. I don't want to sound like I'm an uncritical defender of unions, because I'm not. We had a bread and butter union that some wonderful people took over and turned into a true radical union that would fight the battles that need to be fought. So I realize that there are a whole spectrum. But yeah, I'm very worried about what's going to happen in the fall. I think strikes make sense. In our own ways, we're preparing for, don't want to let anything out of the bag, but we are preparing for whatever we think is necessary. I don't know if that is a useful response.
Yeah, and it would be, I hope that the faculty, or the tenured faculty at least at the University of California, are preparing for a similar thing.
Are they?
They should have been already, but that's a kind of a different thing.
Can I ask a question, actually?
Yes.
It's related to this. So when I was at Berkeley, the faculty were very anti-union. They just were. I was in the humanities. I can only imagine what it was like in the sciences, although Berkeley also has a history of some of the sciences that absolutely have an activist history. But has the faculty become less anti-union than it, well, you would know what it had been like, but I'm just curious about that. Is there any serious possibility of organizing a faculty union in the different UCs? Silence, not a good sign.
I don't know if Joshua, you have kind of insights there.
I'm not optimistic. I think it's probably better now than it was, let's say, pre-2008, when it would have been, it would have gotten 20%. The closest it came in the UCs was before your time at Berkeley. It was in the 70s. They actually came, the UC faculty came very close to voting to unionize, didn't quite make it. There was a move in the 90s, maybe when you were there, that was less successful. I think post-2008, it's been more receptive. Right now, I think it's probably more receptive than it was in 2008, but I still think it wouldn't pass, is my sense of things, in part because of the sciences, although as you note, especially like physics and math throughout the UCs have a radical history, the lab sciences much less so. And I would not be terribly optimistic about union passing, in part because I think, AFT, which represents the lecturers, and so has not been a terribly strong union. So there's no like model lesson of like, here's what a union can get you, which is not really AFT's fault. They're in a terrible position. But yeah, I can't say that I think that the UC faculty are on the verge of unionizing. I mean,
I guess part of this is maybe I'm a little bit defensive about this because I care about my union so much. But, for example, Rutgers, under Robert Barchi, thank God he stepped down June 30th. He was a complete nightmare. I mean, he was our Trump. And he was also so closely allied with Chris Christie. But he shut down campus, I think it was March 12th. And he insisted on keeping the library open. Why? Because he was worried about the kind of lawsuits we're now seeing from undergraduates who said they want tuition refunds because they didn't have the proper materials in order to complete their work. So he insisted on keeping the libraries open. The state and county libraries had already been closed. So our union worked with Randy Weingarten to go to Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, and then ultimately he closed all their libraries by injunction. So for us, there has already been the support, some of the support through National AFT, but we're a union now that has, I don't even remember how big the faculty union is, but the total number of people in our 19 union coalition is 20,000 people. So that, I guess that local story, I benefited from being in a school that has had a very, very strong and a true left union. I mean, I would call our union a left union, like pre-Taft-Hartley left-led union, where we're also involved in bargaining for the common good, and we're trying to get involved in core questions about real estate and student housing and affordability. We're also involved in fighting a battle for Lincoln Annex, in which a school that has a population that's 95% undocumented is being shut down in order to build a cancer institute that Rutgers has put its brand on. So we're getting involved also in community-based organizing. So I think that I tend to see it from our lens. But of course, I remember what the Rutgers Union was like when I was first hired. It was a true bread and butter union in which the most senior, largely white male faculty dominated the union, and everything that they did was not even about all of the full-time or tenured faculty. It was about benefiting the most senior faculty. And I'm sure that there are many unions like that. The other issue that I would say is that I think sometimes, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, in terms of thinking about our two different bargaining units, the part-time lecturers and the adjuncts, because they don't have job security, they often have a leadership in their union that is much more conservative. So you end up with a full-time faculty union that's very left and very radical with workers with a great deal of security. And then you end up with a part-time lecturer union that is very incrementalist and very much based on a discourse of professionalism. And I'm sure there's a relationship between those two. So I guess I'll walk back my immediate dismissal of the question, because it makes sense to me, the enormous frustration that people feel. What happens when you don't have a leadership that is willing to consider strikes, is willing to, we were fighting for a work share program in which we were going to take furloughs. The faculty were going to take furloughs in order to prevent the firing of our blue collar workers, But I think our union is unusual.
Yeah, I think that really hits the nail on the head. I don't want to put Tony on the spot, but I'm almost tempted to put Tony on the spot.
Tony's actually already offered to go on the spot, which for people who come might not surprise anyone. We've also just got a kind of a quick thing from your colleague Kathleen Shannon, who said that you're fighting to keep Rutgers libraries closed because administration doesn't have appropriate reopening plans.
And they have nothing. I mean, speaking to the question, I'm gonna let you go in a minute, Tony, but the workers at Rutgers who are already coming back, the faculty are gonna get to stay online. For the workers, they have no plan. They're not going to test people. They have done absolutely nothing, and they're taking advantage of the fact that there are no true CDC guidelines.
Yeah, I can just speak to a bit to faculty organizing. Thank you so much, Donna, for this. It's been such a great talk. Yeah, I'm a grad at UCSC, and I think the faculty organizing here this year has been at least the most organized that it's kind of ever been. And then there's been networks that have started to be built with all the other UCs, and we have quite a number of really dedicated, really involved faculty. There is like an overrepresentation of junior faculty of color who are involved in these things. You might have seen the images of when the police were brought to the picket, the faculty came down like in full regalia and put themselves between the protesters of undergraduates and graduates and the police, and this immediately just diffused everything. So that was awesome. But also kind of, yeah, like if faculty were ever going to go on a solidarity strike over anything, it would have been this year over the intense repression of the COLA movement and the protests. And there were efforts put forward to try to get a strike across the state that just didn't really have the numbers. So, and also at the same time, like the thing that really kind of ended the grading strike was the faculty senate working with administration to just convert grades that were missing into pass, no pass grades, which just like made it impossible to withhold grades, even with the undergraduate consent. So yeah, it's difficult. We have like a cohort of really radical faculty, and I expect to just see that growing over the next year or so. And as we fight for reinstatement, we're gonna have to weaponize this. But you know, as you say, like tenure should be used for activism, not just this small window of academic freedom. And we have to keep pushing that as much as we can, I think.
I really think we do, because I think that even with me, I mean, I'm a Panther historian, right? I've been writing about Black Marxism and the left my whole career. But it's been interesting for me. I've only been a union activist for 2 years now, and that has various causes. I mean, I was always a member of the union, but I really have thrown myself into working for the union almost full time. And it's been a process of radicalization for me, because it's very different to write about politics and to get paid to say the things you say, and then to actually in various ways jeopardize your own relationships with people and to make that kind of commitment. And it's been helpful to me to be in touch with other faculty that have done this. I had a wonderful discussion with Annalise Orlick about this, and she was the one who was talking to me about the longer history of tenure and the involvement of Philip Foner and some of the Jewish socialists who fought for tenure. And it just kind of opened up a whole new world to me, even as a radical scholar, about the real use of tenure in these different ways. And that's become core to our bargaining for the common good strategy. So it's that those who have the most security will fight the hardest for others. And it's, you know, to talk about that theoretically is one thing, but to kind of invite faculty in. I was recruited to get involved in the union, I'll just say that too. That the way that this works is really through a process of recruiting people and really kind of drawing them into the culture of the union. So that thing about movement building, I've always read about movements, but I've never been a part of one. But I feel like the closest I've come actually to experiencing this, in addition to my work on carceral state and shutting down Rikers and other things, has really been through this kind of process of getting involved with a radical union. And it's very, very different. And I think for academic workers, that process of, you know, we tend to be very entrepreneurial and individual and self-centered because of the way that our careers work. We're known by the things that we ourselves produce and think we ourselves say, and trying to get faculty to figure out how to work collectively and to find the joys of truly working collectively. I mean, for me, that's been an amazing thing, and it's made me understand politics differently by being involved with it, dealing with compromise. I mean, on the one hand, coming from Berkeley, as graduate students alone, trying to fight with the administration and faculty, you all know what that's like. It was like that 30 years ago when the union was organized. But in our union, it seems ideal. We have faculty and graduate students in the same union. And it's not an accident that Rutgers graduate students are the highest paid in public universities in the country. That has everything to do with the structure of our union. On the other hand, it is hard to incorporate people who have such radically different amounts of pay and security into the same union. It creates a lot of conflict. So also seeing how you deal with conflict. And in that way, it's made me much more attentive to practical questions of organizing. So Tony, thank you for sharing that with me. That's extremely helpful.
Thank you, Donna, for your kind of your wonderful answer. We do have one more question from Catherine about about the alignment of kind of UAW 2865 and the kind of Oakland, California dock workers on May the 1st. I don't know if kind of Catherine, you'd like to, I can unmute you if you kind of want to kind of explain a little further, but also, you know, you don't have to.
Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone so much for this talk. It's been really great. I guess I was also just thinking a little bit about, yeah, the idea of the university not in its own bubble, but yeah, some recent actions in which Black Lives Matter and our union have kind of figured out ways to stand together, and without going into it too much, just maybe also feeling some optimism. So the question that happened before, I was like, when I was wondering, yeah, maybe how that was read outside of California, or if it was even really discussed on a national level. I feel like I'm here in Long Beach and going to school in Irvine, but there wasn't much organizing around our union, but I went down to the docks. Like, there were lots of people and activity centered around the economy. So I hope that, yeah, further actions like that can happen. And I don't know, any thoughts?
Yeah. I didn't know about this most recent strike, but you know, like the ILWU, they've done these solidarity strikes and actions, so many different things. I remember when they did one at the beginning of the second Gulf War in 2003, incredible. I mean, what I guess I would speak to more generally, and this comes from my research on being a Panther historian, but I'm absolutely seeing it as kind of that, I want to say the end of my career, but where I am now, which is that the thing that really is the point of genesis for politics is where groups meet who normally would not have contact with each other. So in the San Francisco State Strike, one of the things that helped produce that is it started with some students that were doing tutoring of Black students who were in Hunters Point. And in doing this process of tutoring, they became suddenly privy to everything that was happening with these students and with their lives. And it became really important to the kind of politicization. And so it's often at these sites that are cross-class and also, you know, the racialized notion of class, where people come together who normally wouldn't have contact with each other. That can be an absolute like dynamite in terms of building movements. And I see that in our own union now as we're trying to build a coalition with not just faculty in all the different forms of graduate student and, you know, the different levels of precarity in the academic labor market, but then having contact with, getting to know the clerical workers, getting to know the janitorial workers, you know, regularly meeting with them in coalition. And I think for all of us, I can't speak for everyone, but for many of us, that's the thing we're most excited about, because we're trying to figure out how to build a broad base, I call it 21st century industrial unionism. And so wherever these coalitions can be built, they are extremely important. And that is also, I guess this is a good way to conclude about talking about the Panther Party. So the Panther Party is repressed because it is a Black Marxist organization, and it is the US government oscillates between seeing it Black nationalist and Black Marxist and says completely contradictory things about that. But I think the thing that the US organization is never repressed like the Panthers are. And I think that the thing that the state found most frightening about the party was its ability to build coalition. The fact that you had, you know, it's working in conjunction with the Peace and Freedom Party and with white radical students, and then building ties with Iwar Kun, the Red Guard Party, and the Brown Berets, that they really had this vision of an all-Black organization committed to radical anti-capitalist and anti-imperial politics, but then building coalitions. And I think it's actually that process of coalition building that was the most frightening. So I think solidarity and coalitional work is extremely important. And yeah, I'm excited. Thomas and Molly sent me a series of articles about what's happened with COLA, and when I have some time tonight, I'm gonna sit down and read them, because I've been following your struggle. And the idea that, as Yulia was saying, that they're graduate students that essentially are being forced to end their graduate careers because they're being banned from an employment. The entire time I was at Berkeley, I only had one fellowship. I was always a graduate student worker. So I just want to end by saying, on a real note of solidarity, that I think that the organizing you're doing is really exciting. I was talking to the president of my union right before I got on with you, and I was telling him about all the things that you're doing. I guess we can't call it its old name, fuck you, pay me, right? But whatever it's called now, I know it's in a process of name change. But what?
No.
Just
yeah, please go ahead.
Just the fact that you are all the different kinds of organizing you've been doing, and he also knew a lot about what you're doing. So I just wanted to end by saying that I support you. And if you have ideas more concretely how our union can support you, please let me know.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Donna. I think Molly's going to kind of close us out.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate Thomas's thanks. We are just so pleased that you're here to talk to us today. This was so rich and so wonderful for all of us, and we look forward to organizing with you in the future.